Hey, thanks for joining us for Pact. I'm the P, Peter Coffin. The lovely Miss Astronaut Cowboy Doctor is right here. Master of Science. That's the ACD, Astronaut Cowboy Doctor. Get it? Pact?
Wow, that's new.
Yeah. Don't miss an episode. Subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, or your favorite podcast service. Also, leave us a glowing review on Audible and Apple Podcasts. Help us keep the lights on by becoming a patron at patreon.com/PeterCoffin. Your monthly support gets you into the Discord, gets you exclusive content, and you see some content before anyone else. We have also got fantastic Pact merch available as well. Finally, please tell your friends. We rely so big on word of mouth, so big. We stream 6 p.m. Eastern every Saturday. Thank you very much for tuning in. So with us today is Caleb Maupin, author of Breadtube Serves Imperialism, examining the new brand of internet pseudo-socialism. Fantastic new book available on Amazon.com. How are you?
I'm great. It's a lovely afternoon. I'm here in my Brooklyn apartment, New York City. Lovely weather outside. How are things out there?
Things are doing good. We've got like a party going on outside the house right now. There's this weird, loud party going on.
Yeah, so I live by the university where I'm getting my doctorate, and there's like this almost like frat-like party occurring outside my house.
Yes.
They got like a table and pong and like all this stuff. And every now and then you'll hear like a, yeah!
Yeah,
like,
they're just like cheering
an
raucously.
uproarious cheer. So we're hoping that maybe one of us will say something like really good, and then it'll accompanied
happen
by a well-timed cheer.
We're on a laugh track kind of thing.
Yeah, we have our hopes.
Yeah.
Caleb, you are a communist. In this book, there is a section on your political development. And for everybody who doesn't have that book currently, could you give us a quick outline of where you're coming from and what led you to this point?
Oh, sure. I'm from a small town in Ohio. I did, a little bit of, I guess you could say, when I was in fourth grade, my mom went on strike as a librarian in Stark County, Ohio. There were some security problems at the library, but the county refused to provide security. So she and her fellow librarians, who were part of the Service Employees International Union, went on strike, and it was a strike that went on for months. And I walked the picket line with my mom a number of times, and I went to some union rallies and heard some old Woody Guthrie music. And so that probably had an impact on me. And then I went with my dad, who had kind of a side gig leading nature tours in the Galapagos Islands. I went with my dad to Ecuador in 1999, in the middle of a financial meltdown in which there was mass starvation and malnutrition in the country. I had never seen that level of poverty. So that certainly had an impact on me. And as I got to be a teenager, I started reading Marx and I started reading Lenin. And I was very opposed to the Iraq War. I was in a very conservative right-wing town where we were constantly being mobilized. We had to make these little candy packets for the troops in the morning, and we were just constantly being mobilized to do all this kind of pro-war right-wing stuff. And so in that atmosphere, I became a communist. And when I got to college, I was around a couple different communist groups, and I ended up being in the Workers' World Party for a while, and I got to work with Leslie Feinberg. Leslie Feinberg is considered to be the first openly transgender activist in the United States. I didn't get to work with her as much as I would have liked to because she got Lyme disease about a year after I joined the Workers' World Party.
Mm-hmm.
But she worked with me on some articles I had written for their newspaper. She talked to me about some of the internal procedures. But probably the best privilege I had was working with some really old communists, folks who could remember the 1930s. Who could remember, the Communist Party and the days of William Z. Foster and Gus Hall and I learned an ideology that is really missing. It's kind of been buried since the New Left of the 1960s. That class struggle, Eugene Debs, revolutionary Marxism, I guess you could call it.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been working as an international journalist. I've traveled around the world, and I work in international television. And I'm currently working to build the Center for Political Innovation, which is a think tank dedicated to promoting socialism and Marxism and such. You can check out our website, cpiusa.org. We've been having meetups and events around the country, forums, web conferences. We published a few books. Yeah, that's who I am. So there you go.
Well, thank you very much for that.
It's so funny that there are people in chat who I guess this is their first interface with you after having heard about you. And people are like, wow, Caleb's a communist? I thought he was right wing.
Yeah.
I'll ask you more about that later because I am somebody who has a lot of communism embedded in my work directly. And I've been doing it, my whole adolescent and adult life, but get called a Nazbol, a Nazi, a fascist all the time. But when we read your summary of your political development in the book, we were just like blown away. I mean, like, we knew that you did like all this stuff that was important to communism and like a lot of, especially compared to a lot of the communist personalities that we see now, just a lot of active, like tangible material work. And we were just like, wow, why doesn't he ever talk about this? I told Peter, I was like, his wife is probably like, why don't you talk about this?
To start off with this book.
Yeah, so we just wanted to give you an opportunity to just describe to us what your goals were in writing this book and sort of what was the point that led you to write a book focused on this.
Well, the first thing I want to say is a lot of people have said, why would you write a book about Breadtube? What possible relevance could that have? I mean, these are a bunch of video game playing chuds on the internet who call each other Nazis and whatever. Like, why would you write this book? Well, the thing is, we have to take Breadtube seriously because more people listen to them than listen to any communist group, any socialist group, any Marxist academic. Hundreds of thousands, literally millions of people listen to these Breadtube commentators and are learning their politics from them. And we're in a time where interest in socialism and communism is rising among the U.S. public, and they're being misinformed. And if Lenin were alive today and he saw this happening, he would have written a book about Breadtube. You can bet if Mao was around today, he would have written a book about Breadtube. Again, I think it's far more important to write a book about Breadtube than it is to write a book about the Spartacist League or the Bobavakian Revolutionary Communist Party because more people are listening to them. Now, how did I come to write the book, though? That's an interesting story. So, I was invited randomly to debate Destiny. I had never heard of Breadtube, but I debated Destiny. And then suddenly I was sucked into this universe. I was sucked into the Breadtube orbit. I didn't even know what I was really doing. I debated Destiny. Next thing you know, I debated Vosh, and all of a sudden I know all about this Breadtube world. And I'm hearing all these people speaking with authority about Marxism and socialism, but not being really familiar with the basic concepts, number one. And number two, being vehemently opposed to any anti-imperialist country, any socialist country around the world. And so that was very disturbing to me. And then the icing on the cake was that a source that I cannot disclose informed me of an individual who was in the background kind of advising different people in the Breadtube universe like ContraPoints and others. And that individual is named Steve Hassan. He's the author of a book called The Cult of Trump. He's the leading cult expert. After January 6th, he got on CNN and called for a mass deprogramming of Americans and such. And so when I found out that Steve Hassan was working in the background and his intelligence connections are very well documented, he's a good friend and his personal mentor is the top military psychiatrist, Robert J. Lifton. If you could talk about the fact that, there's many things and we can get into that later. That made me feel like there was a book here. So chapter 1, who and what is Breadtube, the nature of a counter gang. Chapter 2, what is capitalism? What is socialism? Understanding the definition. Chapter 3, I called it Nazi, 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 and how they distort what fascism actually is, and how. And chapter 4, I talk about degrowth and their belief that we should reduce living standards and go back to nature, and their apocalyptic, left pessimistic worldview. And then a conclusion, an appendix, the manifesto of the Center for Political Innovation, our 4-point plan, and note on my political development. That's the book. So there you go. And I tried my best to just kind of give an alternative perspective on socialism and show where the Breadtube worldview is not in line with the revolutionary Marxist movement, the movement that took China from being one of the poorest countries in the world to being a global superpower, the ideology that defeated the Nazis in World War II, the ideology that invented space travel, the ideology that brought running water and electricity to countries all over the world, Marxism has a long-standing history, building the labor movement in the United States, building the civil rights movement long before Dr. Martin Luther King. We have a legacy. We are a history. There is a long tradition of these ideas, and that tradition needs to be spoken for in our time.
Absolutely. I mean, we read this and we know who you are, all this stuff. We're familiar with your work. And so we expected it to be very good and we were excited to read it, but it just totally blew our minds. We were like, wow, this could not have been written any better.
A lot of really good selections of quotes, a lot of very good support in Marx, Lenin, Engels, etc.
It's funny because, and I just want to mention this, and this is, damning for myself, but my first exposure to you was when I was a self-identifying market socialist and watching Vosh debates. And so I knew you as a bad guy before. And then you know what I did? I read Imperialism, Highest Stage of Capitalism, and was like, no. this is not the right path. And then I actually started reading and became a pretty well-read Marxist-Leninist, and that just familiarized myself with your work in a more meaningful way. And this book is excellent.
It's very good. So understanding the purpose that you set forward with this book, how do you contrast that with the sort of defense that they've been making, that you're saying that Breadtube is a CIA plot to kill communists?
That's a rather crude interpretation.
It is.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I don't straight up allege State Department backing or whatever, because there would be receipts for that. We would know. Okay.
Exactly.
What I maintain is that there is a division in the U.S. ruling class, right? That a lot of the capitalists were with Trump, a lot of the capitalists were against Trump, and that there's a long history of this. The military-industrial complex and the CIA don't get along. The big super major oil companies that kind of dominate the global oil market don't particularly get along with like the industrial kind of capitalists and the lower level capitalists. There's Silicon Valley, which is a new source of power, and that there are power struggles within the elite. And when there's an economic crisis, when unemployment is rising, when workers are rising up and protesting, when things in society are very unstable, when opposition to Western capitalism is rising around the world, the contradictions within the ruling class become more intense. Then I maintain that while, Donald Trump, he was aligned with Betsy DeVos, was his Secretary of Education, a billionaire. Her brother is Eric Prince of Blackwater. He was aligned with the fracking companies. He was aligned with Bernie Marcus, the owner of Home Depot. That at the same time, that there was opposition to Trump coming from Walmart, coming from Silicon Valley, coming from the Ford Foundation, and that while QAnon and some of the alt-right stuff was Donald Trump's attempt to build his base of foot soldiers to push his agenda, that Breadtube is the response. It's another faction of the U.S. ruling class, another faction of the U.S. deep state, the intelligence apparatus, et cetera, pushing back. And whether this is a direct government operation or this is just a project of the Ford Foundation or the Rockefeller think tanks, we don't particularly know. We do know that Steve Hassan, who, his history of connections to intelligence are quite vast, that he's advising them. That's one thing that we know. We do know that mainstream American media like the New Yorker magazine, the New York Times is promoting this stuff, which is not something they normally do to progress.
No. I mean, how many communists do you see promoted by the New York Times? Let's be serious about that.
Right. And, it seems pretty clear that these folks have been kind of selected to be kind of the controlled opposition, the voice of socialism, to, on the one hand, with Steve Hassan, to quote unquote deprogram the alt-right. And on the other hand, to make sure that people who get interested in socialism do it in a way that doesn't threaten the power structure. And that's what I maintain. And probably, the most dangerous aspect of it is that there is a belief that somehow, if you are a genuine anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist, right, if you do stand against these wars, if you do advocate that the banks, factories, and industries and the major centers of economic power be controlled by the people, if you believe in that, they believe somehow that makes you the equivalent of a Nazi. And that is a particularly dangerous thing, especially when their rhetoric often leads to the conclusion that anyone that is a Nazi deserves to be violently attacked and killed. So, no, this is not a CIA plot to kill communists. It is a disinformation, deprogramming operation that is kind of throwing legitimate leftists and Marxists and anti-imperialists into harm's way with disinformation. That's what I maintain.
I completely agree with you. I think ultimately, whether it is market incentive that has driven these people to the position they're in, or it is a literal project of the US government, I think this is actually the less important thing to concentrate on. And it's more important to understand that this is where they've landed. Like I was involved in that area of YouTube for a while based on market incentive, more or less. Like I am a communist. I hope that one day we see a world without a state and without class. That's what I hope for. And that, when you see socialism beginning to become more popular, when you see that, you start making content and it becomes, lumped in certain areas. I got lumped in that area, and that was how I paid my rent for a while, And the thing about that is that it goes from just a little area of YouTube into a larger operation as the personalities get bigger, and it becomes more succinct. It becomes more set in a certain path, and it reinvests in itself. And it's irrelevant that it is this kind of project or a market incentive or somewhere in between, which is, I think, probably the most likely situation. You probably do have somebody pushing it. They don't have to know that they're being pushed. But as you said, Dr. Hassan is also advising at least somebody. But yeah, I completely agree with where you're coming from on that. I think that's a very astute. I think, again, you back that stuff up very well in the book as well.
There's a historical precedent for this called the Congress for Cultural Freedom. During the 1950s, the CIA had a program for covertly funding left-wing voices, artists, intellectuals, and others. They set up a magazine called Partisan Review in the United States. They set up a magazine called Encounter in Britain, and in Germany they had a magazine called Der Monat. That's where the Frankfurt School received a lot of its funding and such. And these were covertly funded by the CIA to put out a socialist and Marxist message that mobilized left-wing folks and left-wing intellectuals to oppose the Soviet Union and to oppose legitimate Marxism. It's had a huge impact. I mean, the names that come out of Partisan Review and out of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, I mean, if you go to college, you're going to read these people. Susan Sontag, Hannah Arendt, Mary McCarthy. These folks are big. Irving Kristol, who was actually the director of the Congress for Cultural Freedom program, went on to become the godfather of neoconservatism. He was the top neocon. He was considered the ideological leader of the Bush administration, basically. His son, Bill Kristol, is the guy who does the Weekly Standard. So, this stuff, this kind of CIA-funded fake socialism is not a figment of anyone's imagination. This is a reality. They've been kind of doing this kind of thing for years. And so the idea that they might be doing it now in the cyber age shouldn't really be a surprise to anybody. And it's not particularly scandalous. This isn't like a huge, revelation, like, oh my God, the vast conspiracies. No, we should expect this. There's a fight in the ruling class. The Trump people have their foot soldiers and their delusions and their disinformation. So now, the other faction has their response. But at the end of the day, only socialism can save America. Only getting beyond a system of profits and command and getting to a rationally organized economy can get us out of this crisis. So neither Breadtube or QAnon really offers a way out.
The way that you said that, that this isn't something that we should think of as like this vast scandal is so interesting to me, especially, when we were flipping through the Nazi chapter and trying to figure out exactly where to go with that and what to ask you, just because it is so rich with the exact problem of what's going on, to the point where talking about imperialism and even just using the word finance capital automatically turns you into an anti-Semite, and then you are a anti-Semitic conspiracy theorist if you think that finance capital controls relationships between countries in the world.
To read Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, it's literally like embedded. You can't reach that stage without finance capital. It's imperative.
Well, yeah, and then of course, you have breadtubers who think that imperialism just means like we do wars sometimes, and that's what they think imperialism is. But in any case, I think, this sort of what is clearly happening in supporting this kind of socially acceptable, like controlled deviance of like what's appropriate leftism. Um, you start talking about this very early on in the book, talking about counter gangs. And we were wondering if you could just explain what that means and what that means in the context of Breadtube and how they're being utilized with that historical precedent that you were just kind of referring to.
Sure. Well, in the 1950s in Kenya, the British were the colonizers, and there was an uprising of the people. And the people formed something called the Land and Freedom Army. It was nicknamed the Mau Mau, and it was the Kenyan people fighting for their liberation from the British. And the British didn't want to lose their colony in Kenya, so they sent in the military, and they rounded up all kinds of people. You know, almost all the adult men in the country were eventually like put in these like little concentration camps. It was a horrendous war. But part of what they did in order to wage the war was that they had this guy named Frank Kitson, who later wrote a book describing this called Gangs and Counter Gangs, which is available online. You can read the PDF of it. It's the book itself. It's hard to get a hard copy, but the PDF of the book is widely available. And Frank Kitson, he found African folks, and he organized them into what he called counter gangs. And they would pretend to be African liberation fighters, but they would actually be gathering intelligence for the British. They would go commit atrocities that could then be blamed on the Mau Mau Land and Freedom Army. And they would sometimes try to incite the local population to think the Mau Mau were a bunch of sellouts and that they were the real revolutionaries. And it was the tactic. And later, Frank Kitson used this tactic in Ireland during the 1970s and 80s against the IRA. And he realized that having the British Army fight the IRA created sympathy for the IRA. So what they did is the British military and the British intelligence started giving guns and weapons to Protestant extremists, and they would kill IRA people. And so then that made it an ethnic thing, Protestants versus Catholics, rather than the British Empire versus the Irish. And then you could have, people marching for just peace. Can't we all get along? And all of that led to eventually, the Good Friday Agreement and the end of the armed struggle in Ireland. And that this is the tactic that has been used. And I divide the Cold War into two periods, right? You have the early Cold War and the late Cold War. So, coming out of World War II, communism's the new enemy. China is communist. The USSR is communist. The USA is going to fight communists and kill communists, right? And we have the Korean War. And the Korean War was a horrendous war in which millions of people died. Every building above 1 story tall in North Korea was bombed. They bombed the dikes and flooded. It was a horrendous war. The whole world kind of saw that war and saw the brutality of the United States. Even like the Vatican eventually came out and condemned the mass bombings of civilians the United States was carrying out. Meanwhile, a number of American soldiers were captured and taken to POW camps. And in the camps, the communists convinced them that they had committed horrendous atrocities, and they signed confessions to war crimes. And, over 4,000 American soldiers became communists after being captured. And so, after the Korean War, you had the Vietnam War, another similar situation, mass bombings, mass killings. This time you had the civil rights movement in the United States and the Black Liberation Movement. You had soldiers refusing to fight and burning their draft cards. You had almost, France, the streets of France and the streets of the whole world, everyone's cheering for the Vietnamese to defeat the United States. So clearly this strategy of big, huge wars in which the enemy is the commies and we bomb and kill wasn't really going to work in defeating the commies. And it backfired in Korea and it backfired in Vietnam. So Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the foreign policy strategist who came out of Columbia University and the Center for Communist Studies, he reoriented the strategy of the United States in the 70s with a think tank called the Trilateral Commission. And their strategy, instead of fighting all communists, was to manipulate communists against each other. Turn the Chinese communists against the Soviet communists. In Vietnam, right? Vietnam was victorious, but then the United States covertly armed and backed Pol Pot to attack Vietnam. And of course, Vietnam fought Pol Pot, but then because the Soviet Union and China were divided, China came to the aid of Pol Pot. And you had communists killing other communists. You had situations where, eventually through the work of covert funding of intellectuals and such, the Italian Communist Party, the Spanish Communist Party, and the French Communist Party cut their ties with the Soviet Union. They became Euro-communists, denouncing the Soviet Union. There are other examples, in Angola, for example, which was, you had the MPLA, which was a pro-Soviet Communist Party. The USA covertly funded a group of so-called Maoists led by Jonas Savimbi. And they, bombed and terrorized people and such in the name of, well, we're the true communists, the MPLA are the phonies.
That
And
sounds very familiar.
yeah, this tactic of manipulating communists against each other was very, very effective. And ultimately, that culminated in the fall of the Soviet Union. So the late Cold War was all about this tactic of using counter gangs and covert manipulation of leftist forces and funneling money to some communists and demonizing others and playing this game where if you make it communism versus capitalism or American imperialism, Western capitalism versus everybody else, doesn't quite work out. But you can look at the Iraq-Iran war, where at the beginning, the United States supported Saddam Hussein. And about halfway through, they switched and started supporting Iran. And two anti-imperialist governments, the Islamic revolutionaries of Iran and the Ba'ath socialists of Iraq, were killing each other. And over 1 million people died in this horrendous war where the USA was kind of on both sides, weakening both sides. This is the more effective evil. If you go to blackagendareport.com, I love that website. They called Barack Obama and his allies not the lesser of two evils, but the more effective evil. And that's really what the liberals are. They're the more strategic and effective evil. And a lot of the fighting in U.S. politics is between the military-industrial complex that does not care about long-term strategy for the United States. They just want to blow shit up and make lots of money, right? They want to build the tanks and bombs and drones and make lots of money. And the soft power strategic wing that is thinking long-term about how the United States can dominate things, wants to build relationships with groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, wants to cultivate counter gangs and forces like that to do the dirty work of empire, wants to spend lots of money to kind of do that. And they don't see eye to eye on things, right? The intelligence apparatus and the military industrial complex have a different agenda. And it tends to be the ultra rich, the Rockefellers, Silicon Valley, that are with the intelligence agencies. And it tends to be the lower level capitalists, the manufacturers, Betsy DeVos types, that are with the military industrial complex. In fact, there's a great book that was published in the 70s on this very concept called The Yankee and Cowboy War. Talks about this, right?
That's perfect.
Yeah, the cowboys are the military manufacturers. The Yankees are the Eastern establishment, the big oil money interests that are entrenched and powerful, and that they don't see eye to eye. And this kind of fight has defined American politics. And so when I talk about counter gangs, I'm referring to Frank Kitson and this tactic that was really engineered by Brzezinski of manipulating anti-imperialist forces against each other. In his book that he wrote in the 90s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, he actually said that the strategy for the United States was to, quote, keep the barbarians killing each other. That was the strategy. And that seems to be, if you look at the Middle East especially, that's what they're doing.
Before we sort of move on to our next question, I think this dovetails really well. Could you define for us, in your own words, in the context of your theoretical background, how would you describe what imperialism is? Like I said before, and with a lot of this audience probably being indoctrinated by a lot of these leftist voices in Breadtube, there's a lot of confusion about what that even means. So if we could just all get on the same page with that, I feel like, Caleb, you wrote this book, you'd probably do an excellent job explaining that for people.
Sure. Imperialism is not a policy. Imperialism is not a verb. Imperialism is a system. Imperialism is an economic order. It is monopoly capitalism, where a small group of big corporations and banks in Western countries dominate the global economy. And they stay at the top of the world, and they hold back economic development and keep the world poor so that they can stay rich. Imperialism is a system. It is a global order, and it emerged really in the 1880s and 1890s. Capitalism went from its industrial phase of factory owners being the dominant faction to in the 1880s and 1890s, you had banks, trusts, syndicates, huge multinational corporations dominating the globe and keeping countries in poverty. You want to talk about imperialism? Imperialism is when the British Empire went to India. These people had been weaving for thousands of years, but they burned down all the looms and forced them to import their cloth from Britain. You want to talk about more recent examples? The top oil exporting country in Africa is Nigeria. Nigeria is the top oil exporting country in Africa. However, the people of Nigeria are largely illiterate, about 62% literacy there. The life expectancy is very low. And the people there are poor. And why is that? Because the oil from Nigeria isn't in the hands of the Nigerian people. It's in the hands of Exxon, BP, Chevron, and Shell Oil. Another great example, Mexico. for Mexican folks have been farming for thousands of years. Go back to the Aztecs, they've been farming. But in the 90s, the USA created NAFTA and enabled American agribusiness to come in there and put all the Mexican farmers out of business. And now people that have been growing their own food for thousands of years import their food from American agribusiness corporations like Kraft, right? And it's about holding back economic development, keeping countries underdeveloped, captive markets, client states who have to purchase their products from Western monopolies. In times past, countries exported products, right? They would sell products. But imperialism is the export of capital. It's where the world becomes dominated by a small clique of corporations and banks based in Western countries. And one of the big problems with the Breadtube narrative is that they talk about capitalism as if it's all just a matter of little tiny pencil factory owner and little tiny pencil factory employee, and it's not equal between them. And it's like, that's not capitalism in our time. Capitalism is the rule of the world by these huge multinational corporations. And war is used to enforce imperialism, right? If a country breaks out of imperialism, it becomes a target for attack. At the beginning of the 20th century, Russia and China, they were good friends of the United States because they were both dirt poor countries. But when they broke free, when they industrialized, Russia is now a huge exporter of oil and natural gas in competition with American big oil giants. China makes half the steel in the world, a big competitor with American steel manufacturers. China has the world's largest telecommunications manufacturer. Every ounce of steel that China sells, every cell phone that Huawei sells is something they didn't buy from American companies and American monopolies. And when countries break out of imperialism, that's when they become a target. And you'll notice that that's, especially when it comes to oil, who does the United States not like? Venezuela, selling oil on the international markets in competition. Iran, selling oil on the international markets in competition. Russia, right? What countries have we attacked recently? Libya, which used to be the top oil exporter in the African continent until it was bombed and destroyed, right? Iraq, which had, a major oil exporting country, a competitor, boss socialism. This is how imperialism works. It's about dominating the markets.
No, it's actually Caleb, dressing up as stormtroopers from Star Wars and having an emperor who walks around in a cloak all day and says to do bad things.
Well, and then, of course, it's very anti-Semitic for you to suggest that Western monopolies exist and have a primary influence in the way that the global economy works.
Yeah.
Or that's what Breadtube would say.
Yeah, it's very bizarre, right? It's very easy to identify, the old anti-Semitic trope about Jewish bankers and all of that. That's an old trope that people have heard for a million years. But if you just talk about the global order, look, if you're going to say that describing Lenin's theory of imperialism is anti-Semitic, you're not just declaring that all communists are anti-Semitic. Noam Chomsky would be anti-Semitic.
Exactly.
Arundhati Roy would be anti-Semitic. Naomi Klein, whose great book, The Shock Doctrine, she would be anti-Semitic. This is what leftists have been talking about for years. Imperialism, the rule of the world by big banks and corporations based in the West.
So obviously that's a way that Breadtube serves imperialism, and I'll ask a little bit more about that later.
Probably one of the best examples of where Breadtube just totally misrepresents theory is when they began to start claiming that Marx was anti-statism by using, they quoted him, but they removed all the context from it by saying...
Skippy the Bear.
Yeah, Skippy the Bear, I think, was the originator. The working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes. Now, what they did was not talk about any of the context. They said, all right, well, this means he didn't like the state, guys. So the idea was that Marx didn't even condone this stuff. And therefore, if you follow Marx, you wouldn't be doing this. If you listened to Marx, you would never be doing this.
Yeah, and with, that would just necessitate that all MLs and all communists believe that the bourgeois state machinery is good. Is that what they anticipate?
Exactly.
Very strange.
It comes from the Civil War in France, which is Karl Marx's lecture about the Paris Commune.
Mm-hmm.
In 1871, there was an uprising in Paris. The French government surrendered to the Prussian invaders, but the workers of Paris didn't want to live under the occupation of the Prussians. So they formed their own government. And they created the Paris Commune. And Marx saw it, and he said, this is the first historical example of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Right now, we live under the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. Not, dictatorship, you think of one guy at a podium, screaming and wearing a military uniform or something. But dictatorship means rule. Like if I dictate something to you and you write it down, I'm giving you instructions, or I'm dictating, right? And right now, it's those who own the means of production, the capitalists, who dictate, right? And the state is very much in their service. Well, the idea is that there would be a working class government, a dictatorship of the proletariat. And Marx saw this temporary government that lasted 2 months in Paris as the first historical example of the dictatorship of the proletariat. And that particular quote is him saying they couldn't just use the capitalist government to do it. They had to create their own government structures. They had to create their own police. They had to create their own parliament. And he spends the next several pages, which I quote in there, paragraph after paragraph, describing in detail the new state that the Paris communards created. So for them to say that quote means you shouldn't have a proletarian state is ridiculous. It means that what was learned from that is that you can't just use the capitalist government, right? That you have to create new institutions. In Venezuela, Chavez got elected, but they were forced to ratify a new constitution and change the way the military worked, and change the way the police worked, and change the way the intelligence apparatus worked, right? That in order to have socialism, you can't use these institutions from capitalism. You need new institutions to serve popular power, right? And that the state, as Lenin put it, is simply the body of armed men, right? It's really the brute force that backs up state power, and that the state apparatus the capitalists have created is not going to work to build socialism. You're going to have to change the state. And that it was mainly social democrats who were arguing, no, you don't. We can just get in there and pass a few laws and everything will be fine. And Marx is saying, no, you have to have a whole new government. That's what he's saying. And the idea that and yes, the goal is to get to a world with so much abundance, so much prosperity, that the state can fade away, right? And we can kind of have a world where people just do what they want and do what they feel like doing and take what they need, from each according to their own ability, to each according to their need. That's the ultimate goal, but that's the higher stage of communism. And that's only achievable when you have raised living standards so high that there is no inequality. Because at the end of the day, and this is a really important point, because Jordan Peterson and all these right-wing folks are on there talking about hierarchy, right? Jordan Peterson is on there talking about his lobsters and, hierarchy is just natural. No, hierarchy,
lobster.
Yeah. Hierarchy is yes, it's in our DNA, but hierarchy is a response to conditions, right? It's in our DNA to run, but you don't run all day long. You run when you need to. And
speak for yourself.
Yeah. But hierarchies are created out of social necessity, right? When you have a state of scarcity, when people are desperately struggling to survive, they will form hierarchies as a mechanism of regulating society. But as you raise the level of abundance and as there's more prosperity, hierarchies begin to fade. Nobody in the world was talking about, the rights of man and freedom of speech and freedom of religion until like the 1400s in Europe. And is that because people were just evil until then? No, it was because no one had achieved the level of material abundance and necessity to give birth to the level of freedom that we have now. And that communism, will give birth to an even higher level of freedom, is the idea that once we can get beyond capitalism and raise productive forces, and that hierarchy, the state, inequality, these things are rooted in scarcity, right? When we don't have enough, we are forced to regulate. And when we do have enough, these inequalities and hierarchies fade away. That's very important. And it's the only real response to the alt-right. It's the only real response to those who claim that the hierarchy is just natural. So if you don't have this, you really can't push back against the alt-right, which is what it appears they're trying to do, and they're doing a pretty bad job of it.
Absolutely. And kind of that natural essentialism of like certain hierarchies that develop, even though they're antagonistic towards the alt-right, or that they say they are, these leftists or breadtubers who are condemning all of these socialist and communist projects feed into that natural essentialism of, this isn't actually what socialism is. This is just how, the USSR, this is how China, this is how Venezuela are just, they're naturally predisposed to this hierarchy. In the final analysis, that's what they have to concede to.
Yeah.
Instead of that these are targets of the imperial core. So we kind of already talked about this before in defining imperialism, and obviously how Breadtube serves it. One of the interesting examples that we think you bring up in the book, let's talk about co-ops.
Well, a co-op is a for-profit enterprise in which the profits are shared among those who work there. And co-ops have always existed to some degree or other, and often capitalists are big promoters of it, right? Profit sharing is a way to motivate employees. Capitalists historically, they've tried to pay piece wages, where they instead of paying you an hourly wage, they pay you for how many tires you produce or how many pencils you make in the pencil factory, right? And that profit sharing is a way capitalism can exist, and it's more egalitarian, I guess, because you're getting a share. No one's exploiting anyone else's labor, but it's still production for profit. And the essence of capitalism is production organized to make profits. That's what capitalism is, right? Capitalism, as Frederick Engels, he put it, he said, capitalism is the means of production only function as preliminary transformation into capital. It was explained by Mao. Mao said, capitalism is profits in command, when profits are in command. And if those profits are shared, it's still production for profit. And you can think of many examples where, okay, if we just made things a co-op, it wouldn't solve the problem we have. Great example, prisons for profit. So let's imagine these private prison companies. All the guards were shareholders. They all were shareholders, right? And they got a share of the prison's profit. Would that end mass incarceration? Would that, no, there's still a material incentive for people to lock people in jail. Imagine that big pharma companies were all cooperatives, right? Now, would that end the drive to overprescribe opioid medications and such? Of course not, because it would just mean that, if anything, it would expand the drive to do these bad things that are profitable. It'd expand it beyond the boardroom down to the factory floor. A great military industrial complex. Imagine that Boeing was a cooperative. Imagine that Raytheon and General Electric.
Exactly.
I think I remember that in the book, using the military industrial complex. It's just perfect.
Capitalism is production for profit. Socialism is when you have an economy that is organized to serve public good. Now, cooperatives in socialism can be very, very productive.
Absolutely.
And I mean, under capitalism, they can be a good thing sometimes. They're more egalitarian, but they're not getting beyond capitalism. They're not the answer. And that's the point that I was making. The most successful cooperative in the world right now is Huawei Technologies, which is in China. And it is a cooperative profit-sharing enterprise. Harvard Business Review praised them as one of the greatest examples of profit-sharing working. And if you look at some of the great examples of cooperatives around the world, for example, the Mondragon Cooperative, they tend to, it's very egalitarian among the Spaniards who work there, the Boston to work there, but often they will just contract out companies in South America, when they don't have enough to get something done. Often cooperatives, it is just simply not possible to have every employee equally get an equal share, because every employee doesn't do an equal amount of work, and you're going to have some, who get more of a share than others, and again, in the 1930s, the labor movement fought hard against piece wages and demanded that employers be required to pay you a set hourly wage. You can get incentive pay on top of that, but you have to get a set hourly wage. Could you imagine working in a coffee shop and no one came in that day? And so you leave at the end and you're like, well, no one came in, so I don't get paid at all today. That's illegal now, thanks to the communists who fought for the Fair Labor Standards Act. Your employer still has to pay you, right? But not if if you made everything a cooperative, that would not be the case.
Mm-hmm. And as you already mentioned, there's no way that the cooperative model circumnavigates the consolidation of markets into monopolistic capital forces.
If you have co-op finance capital, you have co-op imperialism.
That was the main thing after reading Imperialism. I was like, oh wait, yeah, that'll still happen.
Yeah.
And then I was like, okay, well, I'm done with the whole market socialism thing.
And a co-op would want to put other co-ops out of business. A co-op
Exactly.
would want to dominate the market and not have competitors. I mean, you'd still have some co-ops centralizing, and you would have all the same problems. Jobs being eliminated with technology. The fewer people that work there, the bigger your share is going to be. So
exactly.
You have an incentive to replace labor with with technology. All the problems of capitalism are still there. It's not the solution. It might be a good thing. I mean, I'm not opposed to cooperatives, but it's not the solution.
Now that we've talked a little bit about how Breadtube defines socialism, let's talk a little bit about how Breadtube defines fascism.
Sure. Well, among Marxists, you generally have three definitions of fascism. The first definition is that fascism is, conservative, extreme right wingers. Basically, Republicans get more conservative, more authoritarian, they become fascists. And then generally that's the justification for voting for the Democrats, because at least they're not fascists, right?
Mhm.
That's the first one. That's pretty standard. You get that from, from social democrats, from the Communist Party, and some others, right? Then the second definition comes from Trotskyites, and they generally argue that fascism is a mass movement of the middle class that is against big corporations, but also against the labor movement and the working class. And then the third definition is kind of a strange one. It comes out of, some of the Maoists use it. It was used in the early 1930s by the communists, where they say fascism is like, it's like a capitalist attempt to imitate socialism. It's social fascism, right?
Mhm.
But all three of those definitions really don't get to the essence of what fascism is. Fascism is basically when there is a capitalist economic crisis. The capitalists, one faction of the capitalists, will take control of the state and utilize it to try and solve the economic crisis with mass destruction, violence, and terror. And it is an outgrowth of capitalism and an economic system, right? Germany, economic crisis, communist uprisings going on. So, Krupp and Tyson and a banker named Hollimer Schacht, they met with Hitler and they said, "You're our guy." And they put Hitler in power, and he put half the country in concentration camps and half the country in military uniforms, and he refused to pay back the debts to the Americans, and he stabilized the economy for a few years, and then they had to have World War II in order to keep the war machine rolling ahead, and the rest is history. Italian fascism is a similar story. In Chile, you had Pinochet come in, and that fascism is about one faction of the ruling class seizing power and engaging in mass terror and destruction to try and stave off an economic crisis. And the best understanding of fascism that I've ever heard comes from R. Palm Dutt. R. Palm Dutt was a leader of the British Communist Party in the 1930s. He wrote a very, very important book called Fascism and Social Revolution, published in 1934. But you can also read the writings of Georgy Dimitrov, who was the leader of the Communist International. And he was somebody who the Nazis had arrested and charged him with burning the Reichstag, and he was able to do his own defense in the court and was eventually freed and returned to the Soviet Union. It's kind of a miracle. I mean, he was a real anti-fascist hero. He was the leader of Bulgaria after the Second World War. Georgy Dimitrov, and he talked about fascism in this sense as well. You can read the writings of many of the great anti-fascist fighters in the 1930s, folks who fought in Spain against Franco and all of that. This is how they understood fascism. Fascism was an outgrowth of capitalism in decay, and that the ideology it doesn't matter. It's not about, fascism isn't about what you say, it's about what you do, right? Mussolini, he had this like weird sci-fi futurist thing, but what did he do when he came into power? Mass destruction and terror to stabilize capitalism. Hitler, it was all about knights and castles and Germans and anti-Semitism and Wagner, but what did he do when he came in? Mass violence and terror in an attempt to stabilize capitalism. Fascism sounds different everywhere. It always has a different kind of thing, but fascism is about what you do. It's not about what you say. And there are instances where fascists sound like they might be communists. I don't know. You may have seen, there's an old episode of Superman where Superman has a bit of a problem because there's this bad guy who puts on a Superman costume and is going around doing all these bad things. And Superman is like, oh my God, what am I going to do? But the thing is, that guy might wear the Superman costume, but what he does is the exact opposite of what Superman does. Fascists might talk against big corporations. Fascists might sound like they're against the system. They might call for a revolution. But what they do is engage in mass violence and terror and destruction in order to stabilize capitalism. That's the essence of fascism. And the Breadtube crowd has made fascism into an aesthetic. Fascism is a type of clothes people wear. It's a tone of voice people use. And it has nothing to do with this scientific Marxist understanding of what fascism actually is. And they make it all about the window dressing, all about the symbols, all about the hand gestures, and not about the essence of what fascism is.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because I think in this Breadtube crowd, a fascist is an individual. It's an individual working class person who maybe doesn't know everything about trans people, maybe accidentally misgenders someone, maybe is a conservative libertarian, and that's kind of what they see fascism is.
I've noticed among a lot of liberals, especially since Trump took office, this narrative has gone out that the problem is that there is this vast secret Nazi conspiracy that has infiltrated the American government. And our job as good liberals and leftists is to help the good capitalists like Biden purge this vast secret Nazi conspiracy from the government, and then everything will be okay. Well, first of all, I don't think that there's necessarily a vast Nazi conspiracy. I think some capitalists like Betsy DeVos and like Bernie Marcus and like Trump and the frackers are using people with alt-right perspectives as their foot soldiers, number one. But number two, even if there was a vast purge and every right-wing person was taken out of the government, it wouldn't resolve all the problems of capitalism, right?
Exactly.
The problem is not this vast crypto-Nazi secret plot, the problem is capitalism. And that, oddly, this kind of weird conspiracy theory, I know Spike Lee pushed it in his movie Black Klansman, which I liked. It was a good movie, but that was kind of the message you got from it. It kind of mimics anti-Semitism, right? Because what is anti-Semitism? It's the idea, well, there's not a problem with capitalism or imperialism. The problem is just the Jews. And if we just get rid of the Jews, we purge out the Jews, everything will be okay. Well, it's not scientific, right? And this narrative that there's just this vast, secret alt-right plot, I criticize specifically in the book ContraPoint's video, How to Spot a Fascist, because I like ContraPoint. She's probably the best and most articulate Breadtube voice. She's probably the only one that seems to actually, take the job of deprogramming the alt-right seriously and actually try to find out what these people believe and counter it. But her video, How to Spot a Fascist, it's beneath her. She could do better than that. And the whole video is about how basically there's a group of people that have a very, very specific worldview, and that would be like Richard Spencer, white nationalist kind of people. And that there is a whole bunch of secret, people like that within the government and on the internet. And here's all the secret code signs to look for, and you can find them. And it almost sounds like the John Birch Society. You remember there was a bunch of secret communists taking over the government, and and it was just kind of bizarre. There are millions of Americans that are confused. Millions of Americans voted for Donald Trump. Not all of them are part of this secret, vast white nationalist conspiracy plot. A lot of them are just taken in by right-wing ideas. And if your response to all of them is to shout, Nazi, Nazi, you're not going to win any of them over. You're not going to be very effective at the end of the day. And I also noticed there's a huge double standard. Joe Biden has made an endless amount of racial gaffes, but nobody claims that Bosch is a secret Nazi for urging people to vote for Joe Biden. I never. The same for a lot of Democrats, right? Hillary Clinton even talked about super predators and such.
Absolutely.
And somehow this weird conspiracy theory, it's like the Da Vinci Code or something, right? We're going to piece together the secret signs and find out who is part of the vast fascist Illuminati cabal. It's like, this isn't politics. This is silliness almost.
It's theater. It's, the way that I always kind of thought of it, and that you said, DeVos, Trump, the frackers, they're benefiting from this. Capital is laughing its way to the bank. It's the barbarians fighting each other. I always compared, around 2016, Trump, using people of color or immigrants or whomever as a scapegoat for rural white working class people, like a modern day Bacon's rebellion of this psychological wage imparted on a specific group, and then working to divide the working class while everybody's just benefiting from this. And leftists and breadtubers subscribing to this narrative is so harmful because it's doing the same thing.
It's extremely dangerous. If you say that the pie can only be this big, the only way your slice gets any bigger is if you cut into somebody else's slice, right? That's the only way, if the pie can only be this big. And no one ever thinks that their slice of the pie is big enough, right? There's an old device they called a whipsaw. It's very archaic. We don't use that anymore. But it was a saw that had two handles on it. And when one guy was pushing, the other guy was pulling. When the other guy was pulling, the other guy was pushing, right? It was a whipsaw. And really, in a time like this, that's kind of what they're doing. They've convinced one section of the population that they can only gain at the expense of the other section. They've convinced the other section that they can only gain at the expense of the other section. And basically, we're pushing and pulling on each other while the capitalists sit back there and laugh. And at the end of the day, if you declare the pie to only be this big, you're trapped. Marxism says the pie can be unlimited if we just get beyond the irrationality of profits, right? That there is no limit to human growth and creativity. There's a limit to the irrational system of production for profits, right? And if we can get beyond that, there is no real limit to human creativity and growth.
And that is an optimism that you don't generally see within, I mean, just the left as a whole nowadays, but particularly in Breadtube, because it's kind of committed to inculcating that kind of ideology ultimately. You see them beating people over the head with their own consumption, saying you need to change what you're consuming, you need to change what you're doing with your own life, as if demand just straightforwardly influences supply. That's not how things work. We know that they don't work the way that Thomas Malthus, for instance, said how they work. You did a ton of really good work on Malthus in this book and on Margaret Sanger as well.
Sure. Well, Margaret Sanger was a Marxist. She was wealthy. She was one of the main financial backers of the Socialist Party and the industrial workers of the world in New York City. But, her main thing was that she was into sexual freedom, that she believed in sexual freedom, and communists and socialists, they believed in that. And she fled the country, actually, based on, being charged for sending birth control through the mail and such. And she got to Britain. The Soviet Union, they had a socialist revolution. She went to the Soviet Union, and it wasn't the free love, free sex paradise she wanted it to be. And she made friends with the Rockefellers and the Neo-Malthusian Society, and they agreed to pay for her promotion of birth control. And on that basis, she went from Marxism to Malthusianism. During the Great Depression, communists were leading protests demanding food and bread and jobs and housing. She was saying that the Great Depression happened because there's too many people in the world because of the cruelty of charity. And she was hanging out with the Ku Klux Klan and other kind of folks and talking about the need to reduce the human population and saying some pretty explicitly racist things. And that, again, this is about economics, right? At the end of the day, it's not simply about libidinal release. It's not about getting your rage out. It's not about fulfilling your sexual desires. It's about constructing a rationally organized economy. But if you take the economics out of it and you turn it into just this adolescent desire to get your rage and sexual tension out, it turns into something rather destructive. And I talk about the prevalence of occultism in kind of left-wing circles as a similar thing. Aleister Crowley, Marilyn Ferguson, some of these folks, their focus is not on making the world better. It's about having some kind of Armageddon apocalyptic explosion to make everything into balance. And that's the final chapter of the book talks about that.
As we were reading this, we were making a joke of with Margaret Sanger's quotes and how just I didn't even know this about the KKK and how explicitly racist. I mean, obviously Malthusianism is inherently racist in itself, but just how vocal she was about this. And so we were joking how fast is it going to be until a Breadtuber actually reads this and takes those quotes of Margaret Sanger.
We do not want the word to go out that we want to exterminate the N-word population.
And says, yeah, Caleb Maupin said this.
Caleb Maupin says this in Breadtube Serves Imperialism. You can find the quote.
Yeah. I mean, that's Margaret Sanger, and that's about as honest. I have not yet heard one honest critique of the book from a Breadtuber.
Well, it's all been the secret CIA plot to murder communists. We've seen people saying he claims that Breadtubers want to murder him, or he claims that Breadtube is a tool. It's no, that is not said in the book. It's the type of rhetoric that is used by Breadtubers does put communists in an unfavorable light, and with the type of action that the Breadtubers actually push, which is a lot of this anti-fascist action, which is ultimately violence against the Proud Boys, getting in violent conflicts against various gangs on the right. That's eventually going to spill over to communists because it continually label communists as fascists.
And supporting the police state explicitly.
Yeah,
there are Antifa people doing that.
And that's one thing I said in the book, which is that, Breadtube is a little bit more dangerous than some of these fake socialist trends of the past because, usually the attitude of these fake socialist trends would be, their attitude would be basically they would be trying to tone down revolutionary activism. Don't occupy your factory, just vote for the Democrats, whatever. Breadtube is doing the exact opposite, right? They are trying to escalate an armed confrontation with the alt-right at a time when the right wing has a much bigger base among the population.
Right.
And basically, if they are able to pull this off, they are able to kind of mobilize for mass violence in the streets between right wingers and left wingers, the result will be one of two things. One being a huge crackdown on all political activism and all speech by the state in order to stabilize things, or two, an outright victory for the right wing. Neither of those are desirable, right? Breadtube is not going to be able to make the revolution by going out and punching it out or shooting it out with the Proud Boys, okay?
Imagine Skippy the Bear trying to fight right-wingers with a gun, you know?
Yeah, I mean, what we need now more than ever is ideological education. We need average Americans to understand socialism, to understand that socialism is not everyone taking all their money and giving it to somebody else. Socialism is about organizing the economy to put people first. I've used the slogan that we need a government of action that will fight for working families. That's the slogan that we've used at the Center for Political Innovation. Imagine, a government that took action to help the people, whether it was with healthcare, jobs, and education, a government that actually swung into action. You guys are parents, and you know that if your kids were going to school without proper clothes on or something, you could go to jail. That's criminal neglect, right? Well, I maintain that the government of the United States is guilty of criminal neglect. People are drinking water that's not properly purified. The power grids are exploding. They're wasting all the money on wars and bombs and tanks and drones in other countries while people are hungry here in the United States. And I maintain the government is guilty of neglect. And what we need is a government of action that will fight for working families, that will, instead of declaring war on China or Russia or Cuba or Venezuela, will declare war on hunger and homelessness and student debt. Right? That's what we need in the United States more than ever. And that's the message we need to get to people. We need to get people to understand that the global struggle against imperialism and the struggle to improve their lives are linked, right? That the people around the world struggling against imperialism and the people within the United States struggling for economic justice have the same enemy, which is the imperialist Wall Street monopolies.
Exactly. And Marxists often get a very bad rap as pessimists, because we're attempting to show that this is all a big connected problem. It's much, much larger than any one discrete, we need to fight racism because racism is a thing. Yes, we do, but it's part of a much larger thing. Now, what we ultimately get is then people saying, it's very pessimist. But you're an optimistic person. This is an optimistic message. You're saying, hey, we need to actually do something that improves people's lives. We need to work with that as our primary goal. And that's really... I think that as much as they might try to paint this book as you saying there's a CIA conspiracy to kill communists, it's really you saying look, here is the actual ideological obstacle in order for us to actually maintain analysis as to what the actual problems of today are. And to round this out, your CPI, the think tank that you founded, could you give us a little bit of your vision there and tell us what you intend to be doing over the next few years with that?
Absolutely. And actually, I'm trying to build a think tank because every day, practically, I get approached by another young person, usually someone in their late teens, early 20s, who has seen my streams and says, I believe in what you're doing. I want to do something. I actually want to do something. I want to take action. I don't just want to sit on the internet and feel bad about all this stuff. I want to do something. And I'll tell you, the most rewarding experience is being part of a community of people who are committed to changing the world and realizing that you're not alone. And one of the most dangerous things about Breadtube, I feel, is that it's very isolated. People sit there and they watch the videos on Breadtube and they feel like the world is so bad and they feel hopeless. But socialism is fundamentally optimistic, right? You listen to the songs that people sang as they were, industrializing the USSR. You listen to the songs of the Cuban people, and you listen to some of these older folks. There's a great, PBS documentary that interviews some of the older folks who were around at the time the USSR was industrializing, and they describe this feeling of community that comes from being part of a mission to make the world a better place, and that what we need more than anything is not, individualism, isolation, and pessimism. We need a community of solidarity, and that's what the CPI is about trying to build, a community of solidarity dedicated to spreading a socialist message. It's not a party. It's not a political group. We're not going around engaging in protests or activism. We are going around bringing people the revolutionary message. We are spreading the truth and light of Marxism. And people are ready for this. I mean, the country is hungry for this. We need hope more than anything. We need hope and optimism in order to get a real solution. So that's what I'm all about. So there you go. And thank you for having me on.
No, thank you for coming on. The book is Breadtube Serves Imperialism. It'll be in the show notes. We'll link to it. It's available on Amazon. I would highly recommend it. Like in terms of what the title implies it is about and the actual scope of the book, it is so much more deep. It's not all just like talking about how Vosh, sucks.
Not a Twitter thread.
No, it's not a Twitter thread. It's not you doing call out culture on Breadtube.
It reads very much like a Marxist text and describing the state of like this new leftist communism and like how dire it is, but then ending on this very positive, what can we actually do?
Again, thank you so much for your time,
Yes,
Caleb.
absolutely.
This was fantastic. Let's do it again sometime.
Talk to you soon.
All right.
Thanks
Have a
again.
good one.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
That's all for today. Thanks again for watching. This is Pact. I'm Peter. This is Miss Astronaut Cowboy Doctor. To help us out, click like, follow, subscribe, whatever. Leave us 5-star reviews on Apple Podcasts and Audible. To support us, become a patron at patreon.com/PeterCoffin. Thanks so much, guys. We'll see you later.